Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley was airborne from HMS Antrim at 0858 on April 25, 1982. The Westland Wessex Mark III lurching through the freezing wash above South Georgia, when the radar operator picked up a contact on the surface 7 miles east of Grytviken. The sea was running at 4 meters. Cloud sat on the deck. The contact moved at 12 knots, low and dark against the grey, and Stanley recognized it at once. The ARA Santa Fe, a Guppy II conversion of the wartime American submarine USS Catfish, sold to Argentina in 1971, and now caught in the open after landing reinforcements at the abandoned whaling station overnight. Stanley descended to 50 feet, closed the bow, and at 0915 released 2 Mark 11 depth charges set shallow. The first detonation lifted the casing. Water poured into the afterballast tanks. The Santa Fe began to list. Behind that single attack lay a chain of decisions made in London over the previous fortnight, none of them straightforward. The War Cabinet that Margaret Thatcher convened on April 7th, formerly ODSA, meeting in the Cabinet Office at Downing Street, had been told by the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Terence Lewin, that the recovery of South Georgia could be attempted with a small detachment ahead of the main task force, provided the Royal Navy could find the Argentine submarine known to be operating in the area. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired by Sir Anthony Ackland of the Foreign Office, had circulated an assessment on April 12th warning that the Santa Fe carried Mark 37 homing torpedoes and could in theory sink a Type 21 frigate from beyond visual range. The Northwood Operations Room under Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse accepted the risk. Operation Paraquet, the South Georgia recapture, was authorized on April 9th with HMS Endurance, HMS Antrim, HMS Plymouth, the RFA Tidespring and a company of M Company, 42 Commando embarked. What Stanley's Wessex had achieved in 11 minutes and what the 2 Lynx HAS Mark II helicopters from HMS Brilliant and the Wasp HAS Mark I from Endurance would compound in the following hour, was the first successful attack on a submarine by helicopter-launched weapons in the history of naval warfare. The Argentine crew, 63 officers and ratings under Capitán de Corbeta Horacio Bicain, could not afterwards reconstruct how a craft they barely glimpsed had crippled a 1,829-ton submarine in under 13 minutes. The depth charges had been the opening blow. The weapon that finished the Santa Fe, the weapon that left her listing against the jetty at King Edward Point with a hole punched through her fin and her after compartments flooding, was something the Argentines had not been briefed to expect. Fired from a helicopter they did not see coming, guided by an electronic system that should not, by the standards of any peer navy in 1982, have worked at all. The Lynx that delivered the fatal hit was flown by Lieutenant Commander John Boughton of 815 Naval Air Squadron, lifting from Brilliant's flight deck at 0925. His observer, Lieutenant Robin Sleeman, had under his thumb a weapon that the Royal Navy had received in service only 30 months earlier, that Argentina did not know was carried by the Lynx, and that the Soviet Northern Fleet would spend the next 4 years trying to reconstruct from a single set of fragments recovered from a beach in Murmansk. The fragments, when they reached Severodvinsk, raised a question the Argentines were already asking in Spanish. The weapon was the BAE Sea Skua, and in April 1982 it was not yet officially in service. Development had begun in 1972 at the British Aircraft Corporation's Stevenage Works under Ministry of Defence contract CN/834A, signed off by the Director of Naval Air Warfare in Whitehall after a Naval Staff requirement, NSR.6562, issued in response to the proliferation of fast attack craft in the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. The Royal Navy wanted a helicopter-launched missile that could destroy a Komar or Osa-class missile boat before it could close to Styx range. Semi-active radar homing, sea-skimming flight, a 30-kilogram shaped charge warhead, 8-mile range from a Lynx hovering at 100 feet behind a wave crest. The first guided firing took place at Aberporth in West Wales in 1979. Service entry was projected for late 1982. When the Argentine junta seized the Falklands on April 2nd, the Royal Navy held 26 Sea Skua rounds in shore stores at RNAS Portland and another 12 at the British Aerospace plant at Hatfield, all still classified as trials weapons. Vice Admiral Sir John Cox, the controller of the Navy, took the decision on April 5th. Every Sea Skua in the country was to be loaded aboard the task force. Engineers from BAE and the Admiralty Surface Weapons Establishment at Portsdown were flown to Ascension Island to fit the 4 rail launchers to the Lynxes of HMS Brilliant, Glasgow, Coventry, Sheffield, and the carrier's plane guards. The clearance trials that should have taken 18 months were compressed into 12 days. Squadron leader test pilots wrote release notes in transit. The weapon had never been fired in anger, never been fired by an operational squadron pilot, and never been fired against a real target with a working radar return. Borton's Lynx XZ721 lifted from Brilliant at 0925 with 2 Sea Skua rounds on the starboard rail. The Ferranti sea spray radar in the nose acquired the Santa Fe at 4 miles. Sleeman, working the radar from the left-hand seat, held the target through the surface clutter. The missile required the launching helicopter to illuminate the target throughout the engagement, the sea spray painting it continuously, while the Sea Skua flew its programmed sea skimming profile 12 meters above the wave tops. At 0937, Borton fired 1 round. The missile dropped from the rail, the booster ignited, and the sustainer carried it across 2.5 miles of sea at Mach 0.8. It struck the Santa Fe's fin at the base of the snort induction mast. The shape-charged jet penetrated the pressure hull. The after-auxiliary machinery space flooded. Aboard the Santa Fe, Capitan Bicane ordered an emergency surface and made for King Edward Point at 6 knots. The boat low in the water and the afterplanes jammed. The Wasp from Endurance, flown by Lieutenant Commander Tony Ellerbeck, came in next with AS.12 wire-guided missiles. 2 of the 4 AS.12s fired hit. By 10:15, the Santa Fe was alongside the BAS jetty at King Edward Point, sinking against her own moorings. Argentine engineers later examined the entry wound in the fin. They found a clean penetration, no fragmentation pattern consistent with a contact-fused bomb, and a copper liner residue they could not identify. The fragments were photographed and the photographs sent by signal to the Argentine Naval Headquarters at Puerto Belgrano. They were also within 72 hours on a desk at Yasenevo outside Moscow. GCHQ at Cheltenham first realized that Moscow was watching the South Georgia engagement on the evening of April 26th. The signal traffic was intercepted by the Composite Signals Organisation station at Morwenstow in North Cornwall, a 6-dish satellite intercept site that had been tracking Soviet diplomatic communications between Buenos Aires and Moscow since the junta took power in 1976. The intercept, decrypted at Cheltenham by H Division under Sir Peter Marychurch, showed a routine Soviet naval attaché report from the embassy on Calle Rodriguez Peña, requesting urgent forwarding of debris samples from the Santa Fe engagement. The attaché, Capitan de Navío Anatoly Karpov, had been resident in Buenos Aires since 1980 and was assessed by the Defense Intelligence Staff in the MOD main building on Whitehall as a GRU officer under naval cover. The Joint Intelligence Committee met on April 28th under Sir Anthony Ackland to consider the implications. Sir Patrick Wright of the Foreign Office summarised the position. Argentine engineers had recovered missile fragments from inside the Santa Fe's fin during the boat's brief tie-up at King Edward Point on April 25th to 26th, before Royal Marines from M Company secured the jetty. The Argentines had photographed the fragments. They had also, in the hours before the surrender of Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astis at 1700 on April 26th, transmitted a damage report to Puerto Belgrano describing a weapon they could not identify. The Sea Skua's existence was not secret. Its performance envelope, its seeker characteristics, and above all its sea-skimming flight profile at 12 meters against a surface target in heavy weather were the JIC assessment, JIC 8223, concluded that the Soviet naval staff in Leningrad would now possess within a fortnight a technical brief on a British weapon that NATO had not yet seen in operational use. Sir Frank Cooper, Permanent Under-Secretary at the MOD, raised the question with the Defence Secretary, John Nott, on the morning of April 29th. The issue was not whether the Soviets would learn of Sea Skua. They would, and the next firing against the patrol vessel Comodoro Somalera on May 3rd would put the matter beyond doubt. The issue was the seeker. Ferranti Sea Spray used a frequency-agile pulse Doppler radar operating in the I-band, with a software-defined waveform that distinguished a wave crest from a small steel hull at 4 miles in force 8. Soviet electronic intelligence, the SSV-class AGI trawlers that shadowed the task force from April 9th onwards, including the SSV-506 Nakodka, loitering 200 miles northeast of the total exclusion zone, could read the radar's emissions if they came within range during a firing. The fragments from the Santa Fe would tell Moscow what the warhead was. The emissions, if collected, would tell them what the seeker was. GCHQ proposed a countermeasure. Y-service intercept operators aboard the task force vessels were instructed to monitor the Nakodka's own emissions continuously and signal northward the moment her ESM masts oriented towards a Lynx firing solution. If she did, the firing would be aborted. Admiral Fieldhouse accepted the protocol on April 30th. It governed every Sea Skua engagement of the war that followed, including the strike on the Argentine intelligence trawler Narwhal on May 9th, the destruction of the Rio Iguazu on May 22nd, and the engagement that would, on the night of May 24th in the waters north of Pebble Island, force Northwood to take a decision that had not been anticipated in any of the contingency plans circulated before the task force sailed. The British Antarctic Survey Base at King Edward Point had been overrun on April 3rd. Steve Martin, the base commander, had been held prisoner aboard the Bahia Paraíso for 3 weeks. When M Company landed on April 25th, the BAS huts were intact, and the radio room undamaged. Among the equipment recovered was a logbook kept by the Argentine Signals Detachment under Teniente de Navio Alfredo Astiz, who had used the BAS transmitter to communicate with Buenos Aires throughout the occupation. The logbook, flown to Ascension on April 28th and onward to RAF Northolt on April 30th, contained entries that would interest the Defence Intelligence Staff for reasons unconnected to the engagement that had just been fought. One entry, dated April 22nd at 1840 Zulu, recorded a transmission from Buenos Aires asking Astis to confirm receipt of the materials referenced in the cable of April 19th from Moscow via the trade legation. A second entry, 3 hours later, acknowledged that the materials had not arrived and requested that they be forwarded by the next supply flight. The supply flight in question was the C-130 that had brought the Santa Fe's relief crew on the night of April 24th to 25th. It had also, the DIS assessed, brought a Soviet courier package. The package was now presumed to have been aboard the Santa Fe at the time of Borton's attack. Sir Dick Franks, Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service at Century House on Westminster Bridge Road, was briefed on May 1st by his Deputy Chief of Operations, Colin Figures. The package's contents were unknown, the presumption drawn from a stream of reporting that SIS had been receiving from a source in the Argentine Naval Staff, designated UCKLE since 1979, was that it contained Soviet-supplied countermeasures equipment, specifically the chaff and infrared decoy rounds that the Soviet Navy had developed in response to Western anti-ship missiles, and that the Argentines had requested in February when their pre-war intelligence indicated that British forces would deploy Sea Skua, Sea Dart and Sea Wolf in any reinforcement of the South Atlantic. The package was assessed as having gone down with the Santa Fe, which now lay alongside the King Edward Point jetty in shallow water, listing heavily to starboard, with her after compartments flooded but her forward sections accessible. Franks proposed a recovery operation. The Santa Fe was, in legal terms, an Argentine warship that had not yet surrendered her crew at the moment of damage, but had been abandoned by them and was now under British control as a consequence of the surrender of King Edward Point. International law of prize was unclear. The Foreign Office legal advisor, Sir Ian Sinclair, ruled on May 2nd that the wreck could be entered for intelligence purposes, provided no civilian property was removed. A team of 4 SBS divers from M Squadron, Special Boat Service, embarked on HMS Endurance for the return passage to King Edward Point. They reached the wreck on May 6th. The boat had settled further. The forward torpedo room was dry. The captain's safe was found undisturbed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a steel cylinder 18 inches long, marked in Cyrillic, with a designation that the SBS team photographed but did not recognize. The cylinder was lifted out of the Santa Fe at 14:20 on May 6th. It reached the MOD Defence Research Establishment at Farnborough 17 days later. What it contained would explain when finally opened by Dr. Peter Maitland of the Royal Aircraft Establishment on May 24th, why the Argentines had been unable to reconstruct the Sea Skua engagement, and would simultaneously reveal that Moscow had been 5 years ahead of the assessment held by the Joint Intelligence Committee on the eve of the war. Dr. Maitland opened the cylinder in a screened laboratory in Kew Building at Farnborough at 09:30 on May 24, 1982, with 2 officers from the Defence Intelligence Staff and a Russian-speaking technical translator from GCHQ present. The cylinder contained 2 items. The first was a folded set of schematic drawings, 23 sheets marked with the Design Bureau designation OKB1 and dated September 1977. The second was a circuit board approximately the size of a paperback book, populated with discrete components of Soviet manufacture, and 1 integrated circuit bearing markings that Maitland did not recognize. The drawings, when unfolded and laid out under the bench lamps, depicted a passive electronic countermeasures module designed to be fitted to a Soviet 53 to 65K wake-homing torpedo. The translator worked through the marginalia. The drawings were not, as the JIC had assessed, a Soviet response to Sea Skua. They were a Soviet response to a problem the Royal Navy had not yet briefed its NATO partners on. The module was designed to defeat the Sea Spray radar's frequency agile waveform, the same waveform that had guided Borton's missile to the Santa Fe's fin a month earlier. The drawings carried a covering note in Russian indicating that the design had been derived from analysis of unspecified material received in 1976. The covering note named the source of that material only by a cryptonym, Source Aurora. The implication was unwelcome. Ferranti's sea spray development had begun in 1972 under MOD contract, with the engineering team working in a sealed compound at the company's Crewe Toll site in Edinburgh. The waveform characteristics, the frequency agility scheme, and, above all, the wave clutter discrimination algorithms had been classified UK eyes only at every stage of development. The first prototype had flown on a Lynx in 1977. Sea trials had concluded in 1979. The radar had not been demonstrated to the United States Navy until October 1980, and to no other NATO ally before April 1982. If a Soviet design bureau had been working on countermeasures to sea spray in September 1977, the leak had to have come from inside the Ferranti program, or inside the small circle in the MOD and the naval staff who had been cleared on the system. The Director General of the Security Service, Sir John Jones at Curzon Street, was briefed on May 26th. K-Branch, Soviet counter-espionage under John Deverell, opened a formal investigation that afternoon. The list of personnel cleared on sea spray between 1972 and 1977 ran to 147 names. They included Ferranti engineers, MOD scientific civil servants from the Royal Signals and Radar Establishment at Malvern, naval staff officers in Whitehall, and 4 members of the Defence Equipment Policy Committee. Each name was now to be reviewed against the existing K-branch file on Soviet intelligence operations against the British defence industry, a file that had grown thicker since the Geoffrey Prime case had broken in April, but which had not yet produced a lead on penetration of the naval missile programs. The investigation, designated within K-branch by the operational name Dragnet, would run for 31 months. It would produce no arrest. It would, in November 1984, produce a single recommendation that an engineer who had left Ferranti in 1978 for a post with the European Space Agency in Noordwijk be quietly debarred from further classified work and watched by the Dutch BVD. The engineer was never formally interviewed. The decision was taken at Director General level on the grounds that the evidence, circumstantial, derived from one defector and from emissions analysis of a Soviet trawler's intercepts in 1976, would not survive a prosecution. The file remained open. The Argentine technical assessment of the Sea Skua engagement was completed on June 14, 1982, the day Major General Mario Menendez surrendered the Argentine forces in Port Stanley to Major General Jeremy Moore. The assessment had been compiled at Puerto Belgrano by a team under Capitán de Fragata Hugo Santillán, working from the photographs taken aboard the Santa Fe on April 25th to 26th, the fragments recovered from the boat's fin, and the debriefs of survivors of the patrol vessel Comodoro Somelera, struck by Sea Skua on May 3rd, with the loss of 8 crew including her commanding officer. Santillán's report ran to 42 pages. Its central conclusion was that the Argentine Navy had been engaged by a weapon system whose seeker characteristics it could not reproduce from the available evidence, and whose tactical employment, helicopter pop-up from below the radar horizon, 4-mile illumination, abort on hostile ESM detection, implied a level of British signals intelligence preparation that the Argentines had not anticipated. Santillán's report, copied to the Soviet naval attaché on June 18th, contained one paragraph that GCHQ would not see until 1993. The paragraph noted that the Argentine technical team had been advised by a friendly service before the war that British helicopter-launched missiles would be employed if the conflict continued beyond the initial diplomatic phase, and that the Sea Skua's deployment characteristics would conform to a specific operational pattern. The friendly service had supplied a 4-page technical note in February 1982. The note, the report observed, had proved broadly accurate in its description of the weapon's range and warhead, and inaccurate in its description of the seeker's behavior under conditions of heavy sea clutter. The note was attributed in Santillán's report to the source of our naval cooperation since 1978. That source, the Argentines understood without needing to spell it out in writing, was the GRU residency in Buenos Aires. The implication when British intelligence acquired the Santillán report 11 years later through a defector debriefing in Vienna ran in 2 directions. The first was that Soviet intelligence had been able to provide Argentina, in February 1982, with a technical description of Sea Skua's warhead and range, figures that the Royal Navy had not yet released to its NATO allies. The second was that the same source had been unable to provide an accurate description of the sea spray seeker's behavior against small surface targets in heavy weather. The first implication confirmed that the source Aurora penetration, identified in the Farnborough cylinder in May 1982, had been productive at least into early 1982. The second implication suggested that source Aurora had access to design documentation, but not to the operational trials data that had been generated at Aberporth and HMS Osprey at Portland between 1979 and 1981, and that resided in a different compartment of the MOD's classification structure. The compartmentation worked. It explained why the Soviets had been 5 years ahead on the schematics in 1977 and a year behind on the trials data in 1982. It also explained why the Argentine crews of the Santa Fe, the Comodoro Somelera, and the Rio Iguazu had been briefed on a weapon whose warhead behavior they recognized and whose seeker behavior they did not. Why Bicain debriefed in Buenos Aires in July 1982 would say that the depth charges he understood, but the second weapon, the one that hit the fin, no se comportaba como nos habían dicho. It did not behave as they had been told. The implication for the Royal Navy's compartmentation procedures was that the system had largely held. The implication for K Branch's dragnet investigation was that the suspect engineer at Noordwijk was looking less plausible as the source. The implication for the British government was that the Falklands Campaign had, by accident, revealed a Soviet penetration of the naval radar program that the security service had not previously detected, and that would now require 7 further years to chase. The chase did not end with Argentine submarines or with the source Aurora file. In November 1985, a GCHQ liaison officer at the United States National Security Agency at Fort Meade was passed a defector debriefing transcript from the FBI. The defector was Vitaly Yurchenko, a senior KGB officer who had walked into the American embassy in Rome on August 1, 1985, and who would, 3 months later in November, redefect to Moscow under circumstances the CIA never satisfactorily explained. Yurchenko's debrief, conducted at a safe house in Coventry, Virginia, between August and October 1985, contained a single paragraph about British naval radar. He stated that the KGB's 16th Directorate, responsible for signals intelligence, had run an agent inside the British defence electronics industry from approximately 1973 to approximately 1979, and that the agent's material had included documentation on the radar of the helicopter missile used against Argentine ships in 1982. The Yurchenko paragraph reached Curzon Street on November 20, 1985, the day after Yurchenko had redefected at a press conference in Washington. Sir John Jones had retired the previous month. The new Director General, Sir Anthony Duff, took the paragraph to the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, who took it to the Prime Minister at Downing Street the following morning. Margaret Thatcher's reaction, recorded in the official minute by her principal private secretary, was that the matter required complete resolution, not management. Armstrong instructed K Branch to reopen Dragnet under a new operational name, and to extend the scope of the investigation to any individual cleared on Sea Spray, Sea Eagle, or Sea Skua between 1972 and 1985. The reopened investigation, now called Clearwater, ran until 1989. It produced 2 arrests. Neither was directly connected to the source Aurora material. The first was an Admiralty civilian clerk at the Fox Hill site near Bath, prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act 1911 in 1987 for passing low-grade procurement documents to a Czech intelligence officer. The case was unrelated to Sea Spray. The second was a Ferranti engineer in Edinburgh who admitted in October 1988 to having been recruited by the Hungarian intelligence service during a 1976 conference in Budapest. His material, when reconstructed from interview, had included general descriptions of the crew toll program, but not the Sea Spray waveform specifications that had appeared on the Farnborough cylinder schematics. He was prosecuted, convicted, and served 4 years at HMP Long Lartin. He was not Source Aurora. The remaining 145 names on the original Sea Spray clearance list were progressively eliminated through 1988 and 1989. By June 1989, the K Branch case officers were left with 3 possibilities. The first was that the original source had died or emigrated before the investigation began. The second was that the source had been peripheral to the Sea Spray program, a contractor, a draftsman, a technical liaison, and had appeared on no formal clearance roster. The third, considered but never written into the file, was that the source had been operating at a level senior enough that the investigation had been quietly steered away from him. The third possibility was raised in conversation between Sir Anthony Duff and Sir Christopher Kerwin of SYS in January 1989. It was not pursued. Sir Percy Cradock, the JIC chairman who took over in 1985, summarised the position in his memoir 12 years later. The British counterintelligence community had, by the end of the Cold War, identified that Soviet penetration of the naval electronics program had occurred, established roughly when it had occurred, established that it had ceased before 1982, and failed to identify the agent. The Falklands had revealed the existence of the leak. The leak had closed itself before the investigators could close it. The Santa Fe was scuttled in deep water off Cumberland Bay on February 10, 1985, 3 years after Borton's Lynx had crippled her. The hulk had been judged a navigational hazard at King Edward Point and was towed clear by HMS Endurance and sunk in 800 fathoms. The Sea Skua and Sea Spray entered full operational service with the Royal Navy on January 1, 1983. By 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the radar had equipped every Lynx and every Sea King in the fleet, and the missile had been exported to 14 countries. Neither system was modified to address the vulnerabilities that the Farnborough cylinder had implied in May 1982. The compartmentation of the trials data had worked once. The MOD assessment completed by the Defence Scientific Advisory Council in 1986 concluded that further modification was unnecessary. The Argentine Navy never reconstructed the engagement. Capitan Bicain was promoted, retired in 1990, and gave one interview to the journalist Martin Middlebrook in 1989, in which he stated that the second weapon to strike his submarine had behaved like a different generation of equipment from anything the technical intelligence brief had prepared us for. The Soviet technical assessment, completed at the Krylov Research Institute in Leningrad in October 1982, reached the same conclusion in different language. A copy of the assessment was obtained by SIS in 1996 from a former Krylov scientist resettled in Israel. It identified the Sea Spray's wave clutter discrimination algorithm as approximately 5 years ahead of contemporary Soviet capability. The assessment did not identify source Aurora. The Krylov scientists had not been cleared on the source. The K-branch file on Aurora was closed administratively in 1992, the year after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The closure note, signed by the then Director General Sir Patrick Walker, recorded that the inquiry has been pursued to the limit of the available evidence and further investigative action is not justified by the prospect of result. The file was retained, not destroyed. It remains classified at the National Archives under the Lord Chancellor's instrument and is not expected to be released before 2057. Sir Percy Cradock, in the memoir cited earlier, observed that the Falklands Campaign had been a strategic surprise for British intelligence on at least 3 counts: the failure to predict the Argentine invasion of April 2nd, the failure to anticipate the scale of Soviet logistical and technical support to the junta in the weeks before the invasion, and the discovery mid-conflict of a penetration of the British naval radar program that had been running undetected for at least 5 years before the war, and had produced material that reached Design Bureau in Leningrad in 1977. The last of the 3 counts, Cradock noted, had been treated within Whitehall as a problem of counterintelligence procedure. It had not been treated as a problem of strategic culture. The strategic culture question, when it was finally raised at the JIC in 1988 by Sir Colin McCall of SIS, was whether the British defence establishment had been operating throughout the 1970s on an assumption that the closure of programmes through compartmentation and clearance vetting was sufficient, that the Soviet record disproved. McCall's note was circulated to 15 recipients in November 1988. It received 4 formal responses. None addressed the question. The file, like the Aurora file, was retained.